now. Thanks, Jared, for starting the recording. The meeting is being recorded. So everyone, please be mindful of your microphone and camera. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Hoagland, MD Air Director, providing facilitation support for the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. Welcome everyone to the meeting. I'll cover some housekeeping and roll call and turn it over to our chair, Secretary McElwain. Since it's an online meeting, we'll handle attendance I'll go through the attendees here and sort of call out all the commissioners I see, and then we'll come back around to check if there's anyone I missed. So I'll get started. Let's see, Ben Baker, are you here on behalf of Chair Hoover?
Alexis Foxworthy should be, but otherwise I will be. Yeah.
Alexis,
yes.
Okay, I see Alexis, great.
Yep.
I see David Smedick, welcome. Darren Lovas, are you here on behalf of Secretary Wiedefeld?
I am, and I'm here with Morgan Ellis, our new Director of Climate and Vehicle Electrification and Air Quality.
Oh, great. Welcome. I see Eric Fisher. I see Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi. I see Secretary Addix. I see our co-chair Kim Coble. Kim Pezza, are you here on behalf of the Comptroller?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Mark Shibist, are you here on behalf of People's Counsel David Lapp?
I am. David Lapp is in hearings in Annapolis this afternoon. He may join midway through the call, but meanwhile, I'm on for him.
Great, thank you, appreciate it. And Mike Hinson, are you here on behalf of Secretary Strickland?
I am, thank you.
Thanks. I see Director Pinsky, Secretary Flora, Doctors Gilden and Dickerson, welcome. Ryland, are you here on behalf of Secretary Kurtz?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
And I see our chair, Secretary McElwain. Are there, did I miss any commissioners or designees?
Hey, sorry for joining a few minutes late. This is Brian McGalley from Constellation.
Afternoon, Brian, welcome.
Thank you.
We do have a quorum, Chair McElwain.
Mm-hmm.
So we can proceed. We have 16 commissioners present at the moment.
Excellent. So good to see all of you virtually today. And first, I want to take this opportunity to apologize for having to change the schedule, the time. We did have some very important things that came up out of nowhere that we had to deal with. And I really do thank you for your patience and still being here and ready for this meeting. So thank you for your patience. I appreciate all of you so much. So welcome to this first meeting that we're having this year. I'm very happy that this is something new for us. We usually meet sometime in April, but this time we thought it would be important for all of us to get together, even though we're right in the middle of session. But I think it's just based on all the feedback that we got last year. And just looking back at how we did things as a commission, which I was very proud of, by the way. We, co-chair and I, Kim Coble, thought it would be good for us to get together and not wait until April when all the work has already been done. So I really do appreciate your time for today's meeting. The chairs and the co-chairs of all the working groups, they've provided some focus areas for our discussion today. So most of the meeting will be about those focus areas, which each of the working groups going through their areas one at a time. But I wanted to start the discussion that we have today with just a little bit of thoughts that came from me and our co-chair, Kim Coble. But before we get to that, I do we do have a little bit of housekeeping to do. I think we need to approve the minutes from our last meeting. So, Chris, do you want to go over or get us to approve the minutes?
Happy to. Thank you. Commissioners, included in the materials distributed for this meeting are draft minutes from our last meeting last month in December. I suggest we open any conversation, whether there are any changes anyone would like to request to the minutes. And when that's concluded, we can entertain a motion to approve them. Any
Move to
discussion
adopt.
on
them.
minutes? Okay. We have a motion to adopt the minutes from our prior meeting. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, thank you. Any discussion of that motion before we vote? Okay, hearing none. Why don't we move to the vote? Everyone online, commissioners and designees online, please use the raise hand function to vote. Others, members of the public, etc., please do not raise your hands. All in favor, commissioners of approving the minutes, please raise your hands. Okay, you can lower them. Any opposed or abstaining? Okay, thank you all. The minutes from December are approved.
Thank you very much, Chris. So before we get started, I want to make a note to members of the public who are joining us today. I want you to know that we have reserved some time at the end of this meeting for your comments, and we do look forward to hearing from all of you. So to start the discussion that I spoke about a second ago, I'm going to start it with a couple of thoughts, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, Kim. So Kim and I met and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and we would like to suggest a few key sector policy areas that we can focus on this year, a few key trends that are affecting those sectors, and a few key decision areas that the state faces when you're thinking about those areas as well. So first, it seems clear that the key sector policy areas with the most significant questions this year that I've been getting, and I'm sure some of you, are in the clean energy and transportation sector. We need to deliver clean energy to Marylanders fast from both inside and outside the state. And we need to keep our momentum on clean transportation, especially electric vehicles. Second, there are some major changes that are affecting those sectors that we need to adapt to. Obviously, the new president and his administration, they began last week, and as expected, it was nothing new to me, and I'm sure it was not new to any of you, but the Trump administration did exactly what they said they would do, and that is to act quickly to change federal regulatory and funding programs. So his initial executive order included new challenges to offshore wind. There were some proposed rollbacks of federal EV programs that could also eliminate, if approved, our ability to implement our EV regulation in Maryland, and likely rollbacks of some of the funding programs across the board, really, including the EVs and charging infrastructure, which is the NEVI funds. So we have some decisions that we need to make. And with these large changes that are happening right in front of us, I think it is time for this state to take a fresh look at our approach to these policy areas, including, how do we structure our policies and how do we prioritize the funding from our existing funding sources. And so this is, really, I think, the topics that need to be at the forefront of everything we do this year when we're thinking about what's important and what is not. Kim, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Secretary. I appreciate you laying it out there, and I think you've done a beautiful job. Just a couple other tidbits on this one. I would also say that some of the trends that are affecting this are not only what's going on at the federal level, but also what's going on in Maryland. And there's a number of legislative actions all around clean energy. Going to be a lot more coming down the pike is my hunch. So we're going to have a lot of action in there, depending on how that concludes at the beginning of April. This commission may or may not have other recommendations that we want to respond to. So that, coupled with the state budget implications, I know the agencies are watching that very closely, as the advocates are as well. So those are part of this mix as well. So as we talked about these focal areas, clean energy and transportation, those two sectors that we believe are really driving the greenhouse gases in Maryland, and probably therefore should be the focus of this commission. We encourage you to keep that in mind as we today talk about each of the proposed priorities from the work groups. And the idea is to get us focused and narrowed so that hopefully in the end we would have fewer recommendations from each working group, but far more cohesiveness between working groups. Maybe some even proposed recommendations that come from two working groups. So we're trying to narrow the scope a little bit so that we can be more effective, frankly. And that's the goal of what we're proposing here. So look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you so much for that. I agree 100%. Okay, so I think we should turn it over to hearing from the working groups and the priorities. Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you so you can guide us through that process. Thank you.
Sure thing. So the slide deck today that's been provided includes working group by working group priority areas that have been offered by the chairs and leads of those working groups. And so we'll plan to just go through them in alphabetical order, which is the order in your slides, asking the leads from each working group to kick it off, explain what is from the working group for identifying those focus areas, and then hearing input from all the commissioners here. Is this the correct direction to go? Are there other priorities you'd like to suggest and then consider? How can we focus this year along the lines that we just heard from the chair and the co-chair? So we'll start alphabetically with adaptation and resilience. Ryland, are you able to lead us for this part?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Yep. And I'm offering a reminder in the chat for members of the public who would like to talk later. Please give us your names in the chat while I do the list. Okay. Ryland, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm here for Secretary Kurtz today to talk about the Adaptation Resiliency Working Group priorities for the year. The first priority that we're going to talk about here is compensatory community engagement, which builds on some of the work that we did last year. Next slide, please. So this year, the ARWG will be working directly with the Department of Budget and Management to put together a guidebook on existing state mechanisms. How can we utilize community liaisons with what we have currently in the system, with the goal of engaging better with communities, having them directly help support the work that's ongoing in their communities. So we imagine that there may be a recommendation towards the end of the year as we go through this process about increasing community engagement overall in any state-funded adaptation and resilience projects, but that's going to be determined after these conversations happen and after we see what the opportunities that exist are. Next slide. The second priority is going to be to support local government adaptation. So the core of that is going to be making our current data and tools more accessible and usable by members of local governments. So we plan to have a panel discussion with input from people from local governments, researchers, as well as agency representatives to open up that dialogue, hear what we can be doing better, and work on finessing that process. And so from the meeting panel, we hope that a recommendation will be generated on specifically maybe tool guidance, creating tool guidance whenever you're putting out a new tool or something akin to that recommendation. Next slide. And then our third priority is going to be around specifically adapting natural and working lands and land use practices. So what are the best practices for sustainable development, renewable resources, and community equity in all of that? Again, we are thinking that this would be discussed at a meeting panel discussion with lots of input from other land use sectors, including agriculture, forestry, and then of course the habitat side of things. And then in this regard, we are thinking there may be a recommendation around land use policies and how can we hone in on making sure we are adapting our natural and working lands appropriately, but then also doing it with equity in mind. So these are just the flavors of our recommendations, and we welcome any and all comments from commissioners on additional ones or how to hone in on what we already have in mind.
Thank you, Rylan. We'll open for discussion now. Any input from commissioners? Yes, Jennifer?
It's my opinion that one of the best ways to assist us, a local government, is something that we're working on with Kim Pezza and Controller Learman today, which is creating a standard way to track climate expenses and to do climate-friendly procurement. And so the Controller's Office is looking for partners on that. But I think having a systematic way of dealing with the costing of all of this will be very important for all involved. I'm just going to drop some federal resources in the chat as an example.
Thank you, Jennifer. Kim?
Rylan, thank you. As always, you set the bar super high for the work group, so I'm so glad you started. But looks great. I highly encourage you, stating the obvious, to stay in touch with ECOS, right? Like, I just feel like the public education and the outreach and how to meet communities where they're at and how to make sure our government's responding, et cetera, that I think it'd be a great partnership that maybe we can combine some of the recommendations between two working groups.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, anything else for ARWG or anything, Ryland, in response to that?
Nope, I appreciate your input and I've written them both down. Thank you.
Okay. Russ, Dr. Dickerson.
If we get that far today, the Scientific and Technical Working Group will recommend investigations into nitrous oxide, N2O, most of which is agricultural. So we need to be coordinating with this working group on how to determine emissions and how to control them most effectively, which it involves fertilizer practices. That's all.
All right, thanks very much. If there's nothing else for ARWG, we can move next to ECO. Amy and Jabari.
Hey everybody, I can start. I have a hard stop at 3 o'clock, but I'll get us started and Jabari can jump in when I have to go. But we submitted 3 priorities for 2025, focused on the teaching grant grassroots education, as well as giving Marylanders more resources. So if you can hit the next slide, please. For the teaching, we are hoping to expand support dramatically. We want to increase our coordination with the Outdoor Learning Partnership. We are starting to this year, but we want to focus on identification and outreach to sponsors, increase participation, and potentially integrate the program in with MSDE's Teacher of the Year, Green School, and Green Awards recipient roles. Next slide. This was suggested by Jennifer Mizrahi, and we thought it was a great idea. So she suggested that we investigate grant programs and potential sponsorships for those programs to fund grassroots education programs, things like resource fairs, events. So that's going to be a focus area of research and how to manage something like that appropriately. What groups we can partner with. And last slide. We still feel that Marylanders really need an aggregated set of resources, of just a single one-stop shop for climate-related resources, including incentives, outreach materials, forecasting tools, all of it in one place. So instead of going after a public awareness campaign, we're going to look at possibly expanding the Climate Change Commission, the Commission on Climate Change's website, to build out those pages. If we go down that route, we will suggest a maintenance strategy for updates and work with MDE staff on the content. And that's it for us.
Thanks, Amy.
Mhm.
Questions and discussion from commissioners? Yes, Kim Coble.
Thank you. I was just going to speak without being called on, but I caught myself. Awesome. These are great. One thing to consider, I guess, and maybe this is directed at Secretary McElwain, but these recommendations are ways that the Climate Commission functions. You're right. Like, we need to create a website, we need a grant funding, etc. And the recommendations that we have put forward have been for the state to take actions. So it's a little bit different, and which is fine. No criticism there at all. I'm just wondering about the fiscal impact and how we would manage that. So something for a later discussion, but question that we probably will have to get answered at some point.
Yeah, Kim, and also, we are actually dealing with that situation currently with the current teach-in, and realizing that we have to partner with other organizations to make some of those things happen, whether they're internal or NGOs, things like that. It's obviously the commission doesn't have the resources to do things like this. So it's still somewhat of a recommendation for others.
Thanks. Brian?
Hey, thanks. I think this all looks really good. I would just, for priority 3, I would just think, really carefully about execution here, because, conceptually it's great to have a clearinghouse for these kinds of resources. But I think you have identified one of the issues is that, the material gets stale very quickly. And if it's not usable and accessible every time someone tries to use and access it, it will just, the whole effort will be for naught. So yeah, I would just take some time to think about whether or not this is something that we could execute on with the resources that are available. And if we aren't really confident that that's the case, I would wonder about pushing ahead with it. Thanks.
And I completely agree with that as well. That's why it's for study.
Thanks. Any other discussion from commissioners about the eco priorities? Maybe I'll suggest, Amy, in light of the priorities from the chair and the vice chair we heard earlier, if initial work could focus on some of the certainly the sector areas and the guidance to consumers about all the resources they have available to affect, their actions in those sectors. That could be a prioritizing function for the working group. Okay, so if there no further discussion of ECO, then we can move next to the Energy Industry Revitalization Working Group. Andrew Place is our lead for that. Andrew, are you able to walk us through the EIRWG items?
Certainly. Thank you, Chris. Yes. Two items before you here. The first is focused on energy planning. The working group focused on this last session, but obligated ourselves to flesh this out in the coming year. This is likely to be conjoined with a similar effort underway in the next working group as well as all of these are likely to be informed by this legislative session, as there are relevant bills for consideration in the legislature. The second one of these, after the energy planning one, is a workforce transition plan, again, expanding on work we'd done last year, particularly frameworks, considering things like programs to train, retrain, and reskill workers, programs perhaps for partnerships with community colleges and vocational schools to offer relevant courses and certifications in renewable energy technologies, as well as framework for state and local government partnerships to offer job placement services and potentially financial support during the transition. And to Co-Chair Cobal's point, I think it would be very much front in mind of the working group to frame what might be a physical or recommended or optimal physical implications for this work. Questions?
Thanks, Andrew. Jennifer Laszlo-Sarahi.
I'm just wondering, is there a concern that the federal government's resistance to wind and solar may not mean that there's not funding in place to advance the careers in that space to the same extent that we hope, and whether we need to look towards careers in nuclear or geothermal, for example?
I would just like to add to that irrespective of what the federal government is trying to do or will do when it comes to wind and solar, as you just said, it still needs to be important for Maryland in terms of looking at the workforce and how do we train, for those skills. I don't think we need to think in our minds that, oh, none of this is going to happen anymore. We're going to go backwards on wind and solar. So my opinion would be that, let's just continue to be positive, I guess, about the future, irrespective of, what's going on in the federal sector. That's just my 2 cents. Kim?
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And I concur with you on that. I think that's absolutely right. But Andrew, I had a question on, this slide. So the other slide that.
Sorry, that was my fault. I moved to the next one, but ask ahead. We'll
All right.
on the spot here for both.
The second bullet there is presuming that a competitive model for solar is better than a REC-based model. That's a conclusion that seems to be drawn in this bullet. And I'm sure there's people that have different opinions and all that. So I would just want to make sure that recommendation is based in sound science and consensus and whatnot. Or maybe perhaps that's a question that we should put in front of the commission.
All right, thank you. If you'd like me to address that, that is the next working group, but I will speak to that. And I think I might have 2 answers to that. One, I would think that our work here would be normative, that the working group wouldn't go into this, and maybe perhaps that wording should be reframed. But I would think that the working group would go at this and asking the question, would it be more economically efficient, better policy to have a model, and then perhaps do a compare and contrast exercise.
Thanks, Andrew, and sorry that I skipped ahead on the slides here. Next,
Can I say one more thing? I'm so sorry, but Jennifer, back to what you were asking. What jobs were you thinking? I mean, what sector were you thinking we should focus our attention on?
Well, I do know that Director Pinsky spoke about the need to really look at nuclear, and I don't know if that's a sector that we have people ready to engage in, and what kinds of careers there might be in that, for example.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And if I might offer, perhaps removing the word renewable and replacing it with clean. So focusing on the full panoply of clean generation.
okay, thanks. So I think maybe it's sort of yes to both. Andrew, is maybe the working group's response there.
Yes.
Chris?
Yes, Director Pinsky.
Yeah, I just want to affirm what Andrew said about reshaping and reframing that second bullet. It makes certain assumptions. That issue will be debated in the legislature. There are varying opinions, and I think we should not assume anything quite yet. So I speaking for MEA, we think reframing that question as a question would be much better than just assuming certain things.
Thank you. And that's, again, was my error for moving us to the wrong slide. And so we'll note that also for the second item for the EREWG, reaffirming approaching the question of the procurement model as a question rather than conclusion. We have a hand up from Mike Powell.
Yeah, I just find myself agreeing with Director Pinsky a lot these days. So he said pretty much what I did. I do not think that the work group should assume that a procurement will be the way that we decide to go forward. And I think the commission needs to give feedback to the work group before they go too far down that road.
Thanks. And so we may be ready to move to the next working group. Is there any other discussion for the energy industry revitalization working group and the two priorities shown on the screen currently, including the workforce? Or are we ready to move to the next working group, energy resilience and efficiency?
I think to keep it moving, since we don't have any hands, we would just keep moving.
Great.
Just
So
'cause we don't
Andrew,
have a lot of time. Yep.
great. So Andrew, now if you wouldn't mind actually presenting this slide that I brought up earlier.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, and that first bullet is analogous to slightly reframed from the first bullet in the previous slide. As I noted, my expectation is that both working groups would be conjoined on their efforts to contemplate and frame energy planning docket. As I said, as I noted, we covered this last year in some high level, but there is a great hunger on the working group to take a much closer look at this, considering things, for example, like integrated resource planning, effectuated through the Public Service Commission, clean energy transition declination curve, sort of carbon intensity questions in the energy space. That's, again, very much going to be informed whether anything comes out of this legislative session. And the second bullet point, as we've already discussed, is focused on this question of two competing frameworks, policy choices of REC-based or procurement model. And yes, and very much take your comments to heart that the working group will approach this in a normative fashion.
Thanks, Andrew. We have a hand up from Brian McGauley.
All right. I know this point's been made several times in the last few minutes, but turning this into a normative discussion I think is really important. I think I would expand it even beyond the two procurement methods, depicted here, because there are others as well that may be worth exploring. So I think maybe it should be, reframed as an exploration of, the costs and benefits of different procurement mechanisms for meeting the state's solar procurement requirements.
Thank you. Certainly so noted.
Okay. Any other questions or comments for the EREWG Energy Resilience and Efficiency Working Group? Okay, so it sounds like there was useful input reframing the second item on the question of procurement and how to get more clean energy into the mix. So then we can, thank you, Andrew. We can move now to the Just Transition Employment and Retraining Working Group. Cindy Osorgo of MDE is our lead for that. Cindy, can you bring us or take us through JT Just Transition's priorities?
Hi, good afternoon. I can go over some of the priorities for the Just Transition Working Group. There's three general priorities. One is we're going to continue exploring green workforce best practices. Last year we touched on, I heard geothermal. So we touched on the WARNF Act that is going to be that is being pursued in Maryland, and this year and I'll get into this a little bit more in the next slide, but generally we'll touch on green workforce best practices. We're going to complete a study, and we're going to deliver recommendations aligned with our principles. And in this slide, you can just kind of see we have a law in Maryland that says that our greenhouse gas reduction efforts need to be connected with economic development. And these are just some of the jobs that you can expect to see in the coming years due to our clean energy investments. It can be sometimes easy to forget that there's a lot of benefits that come from clean energy investments. And so engineers, architects, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about real jobs. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're going to explore green workforce best practices. We have already been exploring different resources, but we're just going to continue doing that this year. We're thinking of bringing in guest speakers and touching on maybe law that has passed in other places that relate to what our members want to hear about. So I'm likely going to be sending out a survey to the members, just asking them, hey, what would you like to learn more about this year? As I mentioned, last year we explored geothermal, offshore wind, and energy efficiency. So we have a study that's underway that I'm really excited about. It will be released in the spring, and it's being led by DOE, National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And it's considering, I saw the notes in the chat about environmental justice, and it's an area of priority considering employment, social vulnerability, and our Maryland environmental justice law. And we'll consider potentially expanding that study as well, because it's looking only at the most vulnerable communities in Maryland, and we'll be identifying opportunities using some NREL tools for the consideration of this commission. Should I? Yes.
Can you go back for a second? U.S. Department of Energy National Renewable Energy Lab is, did you say they are funding that study?
The study is funded by the U.S. Climate Alliance, a nonprofit under the United Nations. But I selected NREL as the technical lead for the study.
And it has something to do with, you said, environmental justice. I'm just asking because in the EOs, environmental justice was pulled off of every federal agency's website, and a lot of people were let go in areas similar to that. And so I'm just wondering with DOE, I can't imagine they, just considering what's going on around us. That's all I'm saying.
Yes, I'm not concerned. The NREL tools are pretty neutral in terms of application, so they're not as politically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Brian?
No, you'd know better than I on this, about the status of the study and the sort of like authorities and funding mechanisms supporting it. But and the national labs like NREL are semi-independent. But during the first Trump administration, funding for relevant and related priorities and initiatives was cut. So, to the secretary's point, I wouldn't consider this to be, fully locked down until the ink is dry on the full study.
That is very true. I'll share just like one example of how that impacts us here in Maryland. NREL had selected BGE to receive $50 million in grants to deploy battery storage and other clean energy solutions. And so that's an example of something that could be up in the air. But that's separate from the study. That's not, our study is doing just fine.
Yeah, we'll double check. The study is pretty far along, so we'll make a note to follow up and just make sure we've got the last bits cleared for the runway here to finish up.
That's right.
And then the last priority will be delivering recommendations, which is a process that we do every year. But last year, the Just Transition Working Group had just been created, so it was new for that working group, and we're just going to keep in mind the principles that we developed last year, which, by the way, we did. It was informed by a lot of research from what other states are doing. We looked at Colorado. I looked at a lot of different policies, and we gave that to a working group. It was revised by the working group and eventually approved by the commission. So they're right here. They're kind of simple to say, harder to implement. Quality green jobs, occupational training and education, sustainable project investments, elimination of employment barriers, retention of underrepresented workers, stakeholder and worker collaboration, and supporting existing fuel workforce.
Thank you, Cindy. So those are the three from the Just Transition Working Group, 3 priority areas. Any other questions or discussion from commissioners for the Just Transition Working Group? Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Cindy. So now we can move on to the Mitigation Working Group. I see both co-chairs are here now, Kim and Mike. I'll defer to you two for who should lead this.
Kim, do you want to start it or do you want me? I'm fine either way.
I think it's time that you do some work on this working group, Mike. So you go ahead.
Yeah, we identified these as the 4 priorities. We put federal climate policies as a separate category. Originally, we were sort of combining a couple of them, but we really think of that as planning to deal with the response to the changing federal policies. I don't know whether Kim would agree with this, but I think of it as a plan B. That is, if the Trump administration does succeed in changing our ability to meet plan A, do we have a plan B? Example, suppose the offshore wind people decide to drop out and abandon their project because of federal obligations or federal objections. What do? I'm not saying that we should concede anything, because I think there'll be litigation over everything for years and years. But I think that we should have some plan B. Do you want to comment on each one, Kim, or do you want me to go through all four?
No, go ahead.
The second one is state policy and actions and funding. Obviously, that's obviously energy is a very big issue in the legislature this year, as our environment. And so our view there is to look at what happens with the legislature, looks what comes out of the sub-cabinet reports, where are we on spending and revenue, and then develop recommendations in response to those activities on the state level. First one is response to the activities on the federal level. Second one is activities on the state level. You can go to the next slide, Chris. The third, obviously, is to take a inventory of where are we. Obviously, there have been a lot of things have changed in the last year on the federal level, and of course on the state level, things happen or don't happen according to plan. And so it's to stop and take a view of where we are on the inventory, where do we have to go, and making a sort of mid-course review of where we are and where we need to go. Next slide, Chris. And then lastly, obviously, as I made comments of, energy issues, I think, are, after the budget, the biggest issue going on in Annapolis these days. So we wanted to have a briefing at late enough in our process, so we'll have the results of the legislative action this year of just where are we on energy demand, grid capacity, load growth and availability, cost to ratepayers, all of the things that are being debated in Annapolis now, but we'll have the benefit of the outcome of those debates, and then develop any recommendations we need to have on that issue. And I think that's more than enough to keep us busy all year. Kim, any comments you want to make?
No, I think that's great. Thanks, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Mike and Kim. Our first hand is Jennifer Lazarus-Mizrahi.
I just have a question of clarification. I'm sorry, I probably should know this without asking the question, but given that there's over $300 million in the CEF, does the governor in the state have a right to take that money and put it into the general operating funds without a process? Because right now, I know about half of the money is getting put in, taken away from climate and going into the general budget. Is there anything that we can do around that to see that money all goes to climate?
I wouldn't dare answer that with Director Pinsky on the line. I would defer to him.
Well, thank you, Jennifer and Mike. Look, as a recovering legislator, I know that the budget process is very open, and through the budget and the BRFA and supplemental budgets, virtually anything can be done to any fund in the state, whether it's in the general fund or outside the general fund. So unless there's a new law to restrict the budgetary process, I'm not sure there's a simple answer where we can say no thank you. And as you said, Jennifer, some money is being reduced and shifted. That'll become clearer over the next few weeks. But I don't think there's any authority except for a higher being that can restrict the use of the CEF funds at this point.
I do think, and I don't know if it still exists, when the fund was first set up, there was an advisory group. I only know because I was on the advisory group the first time. I don't know if that still exists, but that was merely to give advice to MEA about what.
Yeah. Let me just put a caveat, Michael. I'm not sure if that still exists or not. I mean, there is a CEF advisory committee that meets once or twice a year, so that still exists. But I would say this, Jennifer, to your point. Some of the C funds have limitations, like money that comes from alternative compliance payments must be spent in certain areas. So unless there was a change in the law that loosened how ACP money could be used, that would also have to be part of any changes in the budget. So while I say the legislature and the budget committee through the budget, the BRF, et cetera, can do virtually anything, they can't just spend the ACP money willy-nilly. They'd have to also put in language that changes the authority and the parameters for ACP spending.
And I think those are the MWG priorities, if there's no other question.
Yeah, I do have one.
Yep, Director Pinsky, and then we'll hear from Ben Baker.
Yeah, look, a number of issues are going to be addressed. We know that through the legislature. The governor has bills, the leadership has bills, Delegate Charcuti has bills. So we don't know what's going to happen 75 days from now. And some of these are short-term, mid-term, and maybe long-term solutions. I'm not sure how many long-term approaches will be decided upon. And so I guess I would urge the mitigation work group to not be limited. In other words, if there are some long-term solutions that we haven't addressed or the legislature hasn't addressed, I think the Climate Commission should be open. I mean, there are a lot of things happening around the country that we might want to look at as possible solutions. They may or may not be included or adapted through this next 75 days. So I just look, we're going to spend more energy and resources doing that at the Energy Administration, at NEA. But I guess I would encourage the mitigation work group, and not that you would ever have blinders on because you'd ask a lot of questions. But if there are some mid or long-term solutions that aren't being addressed, I would encourage you to bring them to the full Climate Commission.
You're making a habit of me agreeing with you, and I completely agree with that one. Should we go on to Ben?
Yep, Ben Baker.
Thanks. So this is the third work group that seems to be talking about electricity planning and or energy development. Just curious if there is a way to maybe put those three efforts together. Maybe there can't be, but it seems like the three work groups are all wanting to talk about the same thing or touch on the same subject in similar ways, maybe slightly different. So just thinking as this gets kicked off in the spring, if there's a way to do that, or if it makes sense. If they're going to be distinct, great, but it feels like they're heading towards collision.
It's a fair point, I think, that one of the things we've had trouble with is coordination among work groups. Part of that was because we had so many new work groups created all of a sudden at the same time, but it is something we should talk about. Jennifer?
I have a question for Director Pinsky. He gave this presentation to the legislature about sort of the future of energy needs and potential scenarios. My understanding is for a long time now, we've gotten 40% of our energy from out of state. Is it correct that the presentation you did assumes that we want to have 100% created in state, or is the assumption that we want to continue to import electricity from other states?
Thanks, Jennifer. Our first run of our modeling, that was at the foundation of the report, was based on having 100% in-state production. We are having a second and third run based on a maintenance of a 39 or 40% import, and also a mid-range if we, let's say, achieve 20, we reduce instead of 40% to 20%. So we will have more models, hopefully in the next month or two, of different ranges. We started with the the idea that we would produce it, which might reduce the premium. I would say, and I'm shifting to politics now, not to policy. The chairman of Economic Matters in the House has been very clear on saying that Maryland should be energy independent. So I think there will be a lot of discussion of trying to shift towards more production in state. Now that raises lots of questions. You know, what means to achieve that? You know, cutting to the chase, and I don't want to call it the 800-pound gorilla, but there's been a lot of discussion, debate among utilities, among the environmental community about gas plants. You know, some say that should be the transition mode since the 3 coal-fired power plants are going offline. And we're going to have a gap of 3.5 gigawatts to produce. So that will be an issue in the political realm of what is the right transition? Do we have enough resource adequacy, if you will, to get to 25, 27, or 30? You know, and I'm going to take another 30 seconds on this. About 6 weeks ago, the Public Service Commission had a retreat workshop on the question of resource adequacy. And at what point will the lights start to flicker? PJM has been throwing out warning signs and smoke signals that it's coming sooner rather than later. So the question of the short, medium, and long term for Maryland sort of overlaps or is a confluence with a broader question, because a lot of other states are facing this as well, in terms of having enough energy, number one. And I think for Maryland, because of the goal to move towards 100% clean energy, how do we move at a more rapid pace to develop clean energy in the short to medium term? So, that's a long answer, but I think they're some of the issues we're dealing with.
So is that part of MWG, or is that part of one of these other 2 committees that was working with energy issues, or all 3?
That's not to answer.
I think for my comment, for what it's worth, I think it goes back to Director Sapinski about long-term and the need for MWG to look long-term. If you look at the modeling that was presented by MEA, which said, okay, to be energy independent and 100%, the sort of default case after you gave what I thought were very optimistic assumptions on offshore wind and somewhat optimistic on onshore solar, you ended up with 185% nuclear, which clearly makes sense to me long term. I don't know that you're going to get that built in the next 5, 6, 11 years, but I think that's the point, is that for a longer term horizon, we ought to be looking at how do we have enough resources so we're not necessarily dependent on another state, and to have those resources produce as little greenhouse gases as possible. The longer term in some ways may be easier to plan for than what do you do about the short term.
And to follow up on this, there's a lot of conversation and work and expertise around the resource adequacy issue and PJM and whatnot. This group, I want to focus on the first bullet, the last thing, the link between energy sources and meeting our greenhouse gas reduction goals. That's got to be what we bring to light as these conversations are going. So I think there's room for that.
Thanks, Kim. And we have a hand from Brian, and then I think we got to close out on MWG and the next one. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'll just sort of reiterate what Kim was saying, that the focus really should be on the types of resources procured and the state's clean energy goals and greenhouse gas reduction goals. I should also point out that the status of the state as a net importer of electricity isn't in and of itself a problem. It's being portrayed as one, and for various reasons, one may think of it that way, but the state is part of a very large regional grid that naturally will have states serve as net importers and exporters. A state can be both a net importer and a net exporter, depending on the time of day and time of year. So, I think to have these discussions, I think we need to be a little bit more clear-eyed about what these statistics mean, because I think it's really, instead of eliminating the discussion, I think that they're obfuscating the underlying truth about how the system works.
Chris, if I could just take 10 seconds to.
Yeah.
I know you want to move
Sure.
on. Thank you.
Please go ahead, Director.
There's a tension. In other words, if we can promote clean energy outside of Maryland and we import clean energy, some might say, well, we're not energy independent. But if being energy independent means expanding fossil fuels, you can be energy independent, but we're not moving towards the goal of 100% clean energy. So, we have to look at, the gives and takes on all of these factors. I mean, where clean energy fits into it, where ratepayers fit into it, where pursuing energy at any cost, even if it's fossil fuel, and every one of those questions does create a tension somewhere. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Pinsky. So we'll move to the next one, and I'll note this is helpful. One of the reasons we had this exercise is to identify where various working groups' priorities are overlapping, so we can deconflict, identify what each working group brings to the table, and how to make sure that we're not being duplicative, and make sure the working groups are coordinating. So we'll bring this back. This specific question about the energy overlap between MWG and the energy working groups, and how to make sure they're working on those parallel processes in a way that makes sense for the commission. So then we'll move. We have 2 working groups left. The next one is the Solar Photovoltaic Systems Recovery, Reuse, and Recycling Working Group, or the PV Working Group. Brad Baker from MDE's Land Program can lead us through that. Hey, Brad.
Yes, well, thank you very much. This is a very important topic, especially as solar panels installation start to ramp up in the state of Maryland. And so we had a lot of really excellent conversations in this past year. And before we get into these, I really just want to thank the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins for all the work that they put into helping us draft the report that we submitted. We couldn't have done it without them. So the first one is talking about incentives that could bring a solar recycler into the state of Maryland, or maybe develop a partnership with surrounding states to get a regional resource. In the state of Maryland, we're pretty strategically aligned, or we're strategically on the 95 corridor. So there could be areas, potential areas there to set up a regional resource that would mean jobs for the state of Maryland. It would mean additional tax revenue, and it would provide a resource for recycling. I think the closest solar recycler right now is maybe in Ohio. There's one that is, I believe, setting up in Georgia. But in terms of New England or the Mid-Atlantic, I mean, those other recyclers will take those solar panels, but you have the additional mileage of transporting solar panels, the emissions that are associated with that. So there's a lot of discussion on maybe trying to bring something at least regionally, but look in Maryland first, especially since we're on the 95 corridor. There could be a lot of potential there. The next one is, and this one's kind of a two-parter. So we had a lot of discussion on if you have utility level solar, there's already a plan that is being developed for decommissioning. There is bonding that is being set up to pay for that eventual decommissioning of those solar panels. And a lot of these utility level scale or level solar players, they have environmental teams that can help with the eventual decommissioning of those solar panels. The conversation that we had on the residential side is you don't necessarily have that robust infrastructure for residential solar panels. So I just got some solar panels. There was no conversation on what we're going to do with those solar panels at the end of the useful life of those panels. That conversation is happening and is required as a part of the utility level solar installation. So this was talking about, can we start a stewardship organization? And this is a very that would be able to help residential folks manage the end of life management of their solar panels. The funding might be a little bit tenuous for that, but there was some support for an advanced recovery fee. So this would be a very small fee, and we do have some qualifications on here as well, that when solar panels are procured at a residential level, there would be a small fee, and then that would help with the eventual decommissioning of those solar panels. Because like in the utility level side, there's bonding that's being set up. So there is a funding mechanism, but you don't have that on the residential side. So that's something that we're going to be looking at. Yeah.
Yes, Secretary.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand. So did you say the fee would be transferred to a resident, a homeowner who are buying the panels? They would pay an additional fee?
So that was the thinking, and then that will go to the stewardship organization to help with the transportation, finding an appropriate recycler, as a part of the eventual decommissioning that will need to happen for these solar panels.
Okay, maybe I'll ask more later, but okay, thank you. Thanks for answering.
Thanks. And Mike?
Yeah, I may have maybe the same question the secretary was hinting at. Right now, our biggest problem with getting solar panels on residential roofs is the upfront cost. Adding a fee at installation is inevitably going to be borne by the purchaser. Even if you impose it on the company, they'll simply pass it through. I think we've got to be very careful about anything that increases the initial capital cost of putting panels on a rooftop.
But that was where my mind was, because the panels are already in the installation, thousands and thousands of dollars. But I do understand the decommissioning piece of it. I'm wondering, panels last for 20 years, so I don't have no idea of what's going on so far. Like if someone's panels are done at the end of life, what happens to those panels?
Yeah. So folks out on a residential side, people will have to figure out to do their own research. But if you're on the utility side, there's a plan that you have to submit as a part of that decommissioning process. And you have to set up bonding, and you have to identify what the plan is for the decommissioning as a part of that. You just don't have that level of rigor on the residential side. So wherever the funding comes from, that might this was an idea that was thrown out that had some support within our pretty diverse set of stakeholders, and including some that represented the solar industry. So yeah, that's we would look for some guidance from the commission on that. But this is something that we're going to have to deal with. There's been other types of recyclable materials where stockpiling has happened. There was just some settlements in Arizona for a case of stockpiling of $10.8 million. So there needs to be end markets, and you need to get those panels to the end markets. And the transporters and the recyclers don't do that for free also.
Thanks, Brad. So I think, yeah, we're getting some guidance from the commission here to maybe that any recommendations effect should have some, a lot of information about what it would mean. Brian, is your comment about this priority number 2?
Yeah, I just wanted to just sort of
Please
add
go
a
ahead.
little context. I don't have the statistics at my fingertips, but not all residential solar installations are financed up front by the customer. A lot are financed under third-party leases, loan programs, and so forth. So while this would be an additional fee, it may not be one that shows up in the initial upfront cost for the customer to install solar.
Just my 2 cents on this. I would think that we would need a lot more information on what exactly happens with panels. I would just, I don't know. But again, those are questions I'll ask later. But I don't think we have enough information to concretely say this is what's going on when panels are at the end of its life. I know if you're getting new panels, then it's not, I'm not even sure if it's the homeowner's concern, because the new company, I thought, usually take those panels away. Anyway, we've been on this one too long. So just questions I have later on about this whole idea. Although I think it's a great idea to think about decommissioning panels when they're done.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about extended producer responsibility. Washington went down that road. They had some of the solar panel manufacturers say that they were no longer going to sell in the state of Washington, so they are rethinking that strategy. But yeah, the funding is going to be the what needs to be resolved for this recommendation. So, all right, the next one. So with reduce, reuse, recycling, you have to reuse before you recycle, or as a general priority. Sometimes that can't happen. But whether it's incentives or whether it's something that's in the legislative intent for any bill that helps promote the recycling and reuse of solar panels, it's really talking about how do you prioritize reuse before you automatically assume that a panel should be going to recycling. We also had some discussion on workforce development and training. So if you are going to be transporting decommissioned solar panels, are you trained to handle that so you're not accidentally causing cracks in these solar panels or some other issue where there would be an additional cost to bring them to be able to donate them or sell them at a reduced price if that crack or whatever it is had not happened. So there was some discussion on that as well. This would need to be funded. We didn't really get into that, but where the funding would come from, it was more that to try and preserve panels while they're being transported to the best of our abilities, and to have competent people doing that. Competent and trained.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, any other questions, discussion of the 3 priorities from the PV working group? All right, thanks. So we have 1 working group left. It's the scientists. We save the scientists for last. Note to members of the public, if you'd like, I have not seen any sign up for comment yet. So if you do want to, please do that in part so we understand how much time we have left. Please put your name in the chat. While we wait for that, let's move on to scientific and technical working group. I believe Dave Namazi is here for Dr. Morales Wilhelm to take us.
Yes, thank you.
priorities. Hey, Dave.
Sorry that Fernando was unable to make today's meeting. CESA is in a series of events celebrating our 100th anniversary, and one event was occurring today, and with the change in meeting, he just couldn't make it. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I'll just, recognizing that we're last and between you and adjournment, I'll kind of go through these quickly. First and foremost, we're going to do a deep dive into nitrous oxide, N2O, much like we did last year on methane. While, certainly N2O is being considered and addressed by the Climate Commission, understanding the dynamics of it from a scientific perspective really helps us better. It's a very potent climate change gas. And so we just want to do a deeper dive with various experts on N2O to help the science panel understand the dynamics of the sources, the dynamics of trying to mitigate it, and next steps. This was incredibly helpful for us in methane, and we expect it to be so for nitrous oxide. Next slide, please. Some of you who've been in the Maryland climate change game for quite some time, in 08, UMCs with a lot of other friends helped put together a report called Global Warming in the Free State. This was really looking at the impacts of climate change on Maryland based on the various studies that were out there. And we look at redoing this report to help ground the efforts that we're all doing. And again, this came out in 08, so that's, my math is correct, that's 17 years ago. And we're looking to update it and redo it. That'll take us some time to do, but we do think it's really important to help this body as well as agencies and the stakeholder groups to have some scientific grounding on what predictions we can now make better than we have in the past. The third one, please. So building off of the Maryland climate reduction plan, we want to really take a look at the carbon net zero scenario analysis and do some sort of pre-thinking, if you will, or scientific thinking about what that means, and to look at explore carbon offsets, identify timelines and milestones, and really try to identify the metrics to monitor and track progress. We understand, the major sectors, that what they're trying to achieve, and what, this kind of gets into the technology of the STWG working group, as well as really trying to just see how to get from here to there, and what that world may look like. So this is going to probably take about a year and a half to 2 years to complete, but we want to start this year and move that out into out years. We anticipate for these last two priorities that I've talked about to really engage a lot of different members and experts, not only within the scientific community, but within the stakeholder communities and the commission itself as we go through this. So I'll stop there, and certainly willing to take any questions, and I'll brief Fernando after this meeting if there are any recommendations and changes.
Thanks, Dave. Questions, discussion for the STWG? Yes, Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi.
So last year we heard a presentation that suggested that some of the ways that we're restoring and protecting shoreline is causing a bigger problem for climate change. And I didn't know, are we going to continue that vein? Number one. Number two, is this health impacts is so very important. I don't know if you're going to have a financial component to that in terms of, for example, if we have coal ash in Baltimore, what is the financial cost of and the human cost of the asthma in the surrounding areas? And then as the federal government has, changed its whole scenario, we have to worry about all kinds of impacts spillover into our state, whether you're going to look at the cost of, inability to get insurance for, flood insurance and that sort of thing, or is that outside the scope of this particular group?
Thanks. Hopefully I'll answer these in order, Jennifer, but if not, help me out. So on the first one, yes, I think one of the important things that came out of the methane understanding was, how some things may not be working as we had expected them to. And that's partly why we want to look at N2O gas now. You'll recall for methane, we did have a recommendation that ultimately did not make it into the final report. We may also have discussions about that and how to move that recommendation forward after further discussions with stakeholder communities. And I think that was one of the major points of concern. Chris, do you mind moving to priority 2? Just up one slide, thank you. Regarding, we recognize and what we've done in the past, we being in this 08 report in the past, we really didn't consider much about human health. We touched on it, but it wasn't nearly as central as we thought it, it could have been done in retrospect. And we are hoping to include findings, that the Maryland Department of Health and College Park have done in a major grant that they had. Although, frankly, there's important talk about trying to get that refunded and do some of that work, update that work with, again, the new science that's coming out. So I think that's really critical. With regards to, cost benefit of any actions per se, I don't know if I think that's a great point. I don't know if we'll actually be able to do the financial analysis on many of these things as much as the deep dive into the understanding of how they may or may not work. That's my opinion. Perhaps Fernando has a different one. I don't think we've talked as much about cost benefit analysis, whether that's related to coal or other things. Fernando is a big believer in trying to understand and tie together, the action costs and actions and the sociology behind all that, because it's so central to getting work done. I'll need to check with them on that, Jennifer, but that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Thanks. Quick time check. We have a couple minutes left. If there are no other questions or discussion or direction for STWG, then we could move to public comment. Okay, thanks so much to all of the working group leads for bringing those priorities to the commission, and thanks so much to all the commissioners for providing direction. We have one person signed up for public comment, Jeff Silva. Mr. Silva, if you wouldn't mind keeping your comment to 2 minutes, as we're running a little short on time, I'd appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Can I start?
Please do.
All right, basically, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I have several items that I want to bring to the attention of MCCC. First of all, about the energy industry and vitalization working group priority to develop frameworks for work group transition and its associated programs. That priority is directly related to the dilemma of Maryland selecting, installing, and getting the long-term maintenance of heat pump water heaters. Does a customer hire a plumber because it's a plumbing project, or does the customer hire an AC repair contractor because he has the equipment, the trained and licensed personnel to work on the heat pump's regulated refrigerant? Also, the photovoltaic systems recovery, reuse, and recycling working group. Basically, you have the stewardship organization, could be a nonprofit or a state entity that helps residents with end-of-life panel management. I think that is a very important, critical priority. Once we start having more extreme weather events, you're going to end up with photovoltaic panels that have been savaged by the weather. I remember there was a image that I saw with what happened in Puerto Rico with a community-based solar farm, and it was just out and out devastating. And you've got to think about that the metals and the materials that are inherent in the photovoltaic panel, and if Maryland is positioned to be able to handle that prior to the other states, then it will be able to collect money and revenue from other surrounding states in order to be able to process those damaged panels and also return them, their materials at least, to be recycled.
Thanks, Mr. Silva. If you wouldn't mind wrapping up as we've been a couple minutes. Appreciate it.
That's basically it. And the rest of it I could relay to my elected officials. Thank you.
Appreciate it. So sorry for the short time today. Thank you for your comment. That brings us to the end of the agenda today, so we can move to conclusions. Chair McElwain.
Yeah, I just want to thank all of you again for this discussion and the direction that we have. It's really important for us to, like I said earlier, to focus our work this year on the highest priorities that we're facing. And I really do think the discussion that we had today will set us up for a good process when the working groups are bringing, those recommendations for us to consider in the fall. And I just appreciate your time today and the entire discussion. So thank you so much. And I guess we'll see you the next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.